Big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
Hi, everybody. It's August 1st, 2025, the year of our Lord. It's David Leese here, your host for Leaders on the Frontier, and so glad that you could join us. We value very much your comments and feedback, and it really makes our day. So please keep them coming. And we're so glad that you could join us for, it's interesting. We have that introduction for Leaders on the Frontier, and the narrative there is we dare to talk about big topics. Well, this is no exception. We're going to talk about big topics again every Thursday on the live, as well as the other programming. And so I'll get to that in a moment. I did want to mention that I did have the occasion to be on a family vacation, a very interesting trip. And so we traveled to a number of places. And as you know, I'm a student of history, so it was very interesting. And today is August the 1st. So as a faithful student of history, you may know that on August the 1st in 30 BC, something interesting happened. Octavian entered Alexandria, Egypt, bringing it under Roman control and ending the reign of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Go figure. So if you want to learn more about that, there's lots of great books on it, including a movie, as I recall, with Elizabeth Taylor and Pierre Burton, Mr. Burton. But in any case, go look at the movie and find that out. This is also a busy week in Canada's history. In fact, this past Saturday, July the 27th, a biochemist named Frederick Banting and his team of researchers at the University of Toronto isolated insulin. So I thought that was an appropriate note for our next guest, who's an incredible scientist and a friend. And he did something very courageous. He spoke up about something that really mattered not only to himself, but to, I would argue, the rest of society and humanity. And that's no overstatement. And that is Dr. Martin Kulldorff. So Martin Kulldorff has certainly been in the news, and he's certainly shook the world in his own unique way, among others, including Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, and we'll get to that in a moment. And so the whole point is we're going to talk about truth-telling. We're going to talk about the importance of freedom of speech in the scientific process. And his story is very much a case study, as he was fired or let go from Harvard University. So I want to welcome our friend, Dr. Martin Kulldorff. And Martin is coming in from Nicaragua. So a warm welcome to you, our friend.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Well, it's great to see you, Martin. And we certainly have admired you over the years and have had numerous interesting conversations. And for those of you who don't know you, you're a biostatistician, an epidemiologist, and up until recently, you were a full professor at Harvard University. And so what I want to do is we've got a lot of interesting topics today to cover in terms of your story and its implications, I think. But we want to go back to 2020. So if you could take us back a little bit in time to when COVID came up on your radar. And I still remember the story about how you did some calculations at the back of an envelope. But can you take us back in your mind to 2020 when you first started hearing about this mysterious virus named COVID-19?
Well, in early 2020, when COVID reached northern Italy and Iran, which were the first two countries outside of China where it hit, it was obvious to me as an epidemiologist that this was spread to the whole world. There was no way to avoid that because it had arrived to these countries without us knowing exactly who brought it in. So it was sort of moving under the radar, this infection, like many infections do. So it was obvious that we will eventually see it in the US, in Canada, in Western Europe, in South America, and so on. just a question of time. So, of course, I was scared for about 10, 20 minutes because
you were scared for about 10 or 20 minutes.
Yes. So I have 3 children. And as every parent, I care much more about the health and well-being of my children than about myself. Mm-hmm. So I quickly looked at the data from Wuhan, and there wasn't much data at that point, but there was available who in Wuhan had died from COVID and what were their ages. So it's obvious that during this time, people were about equally exposed on different age groups. Mm-hmm. But the mortality was much, much higher in older people and almost nothing in younger people. Mm-hmm. So I did this calculation at the back of the envelope to find out what the risks were, and we still didn't know the absolute risk. But with this, I could calculate the relative risk. How much more dangerous were it for older versus younger people? And I concluded, which turned out to be accurate, that it was more than 1,000 more likely for an older person to die from COVID than from a younger person. Mm. So then I was clear, okay, my kids will be fine. They're not going to die from this. And it turns out that the risk for a child dying from COVID was less than the risk of dying from influenza during a typical influenza season. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, but that also means that the strategy was quite obvious. If you are a public health person, like I am a public health scientist, that since it's the older people who are at high risk, we have to protect them.
Indeed.
While we let younger people, children go to school, younger adults live normal lives. And that's how we should have dealt with the pandemic. But instead, the world went crazy. It threw the basic principles of public health out the window. The plans that had been put together for pandemic preparedness were thrown under the bus. And instead, we did the general lockdowns in most of the world.
It truly is remarkable.
And that has had enormous collateral damage on other aspects of public health. Because one of the principles of public health is that you can't just worry about one disease and not ignore everything else. So you can't just worry about COVID and ignore the effects of lockdown has on cancer treatment and cancer screening, on the fact that people who have chest pain won't go to the hospital because they're afraid of going to the hospital and then they die at home. Of all the mental problems that people have because of these lockdowns that have skyrocketed. Of course, education is important for education. It's also important for public health. We know that as education improves, public health also improves. Mm-hmm. And of course, schools are not only important for the academics of children, it's also important for the social, learning social behavior and engaging with friends and so on. So social skills. So we threw the children certainly under the bus pandemic, which we should never, ever do. I mean, the children are the most precious part of our society. So those are the ones we should protect. And instead, we kicked them out of schools in large parts of the US and in many other countries in Europe and so on. So it was a complete public health disaster. And it was also unavoidable. The evidence was clear that the children were at a minuscule risk while older people were at high risk. So we should have protected the older people. At the same time, we didn't do a good job protecting older people. A lot of people in the nursing home died. They were at the highest risk because there was too much staff rotation. So you can't avoid all death in a situation like this. You can't avoid all mortality. That's impossible. But you can reduce it by, for example, in nursing home, having less staff rotation. In the US, people were testing university students. You don't have to do that. Instead, we should have done more testing of staff in nursing homes to reduce the spread there. So we had a completely upside down approach to this pandemic. And I think it's an embarrassment for both the scientific community and the public health community that we were not able to do this properly.
No, I think that's a brilliant summation, Martin, of a number of years of a really a tragic response to a virus that you put into perspective fairly early on, in terms of its risks, particularly for a specific older part of the population with comorbidities or health challenges. And I think that, so it wasn't surprising then that you teamed up with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford and Dr. Sunita Gupta, both leaders in their fields. She's at Oxford, to formulate the Great Barrington Declaration. Can you tell us more about what that declaration meant?
Yeah, so first in the spring of 2020 and the summer of 2020, it was very frustrating because I was trying to get my views across and published, and I was unable to do so in the United States. In my native Sweden, I had no problems publishing in the major daily newspapers to defend the Swedish strategy, because Sweden was the one country in the Western world that did not lock down as the rest of the world. They kept schools open for all the kids aged 1 to 15 and so on throughout the spring of 2020. It didn't close down the whole society. So I was able to publish there to defend what Sweden was doing, but it wasn't until August of 2020 that I was able to publish something in the US, and it was CNN. But it was CNN Espanol. CNN English didn't want it. So, but I know how to write Spanish, so I figured, okay, if they won't publish what I write in English, I'll write in Spanish instead.
Okay, but this is rather interesting that you could publish. I mean, anyone who looks at your academic background can see that you have a very robust record as a full professor at Harvard in terms of peer-reviewed publications, and you're one of the leaders in your field, and yet you could not publish, you're saying, within the United States or the North American context, but you could publish in Sweden this perspective about following or imploring decision makers to follow best practices when it came to public health care.
Yep, no, that's true. And so it was very frustrating. And I was also blacklisted on Twitter. I had an old Twitter account with very few, like a few hundred followers that I started to use in the summer of 2020, but I was blacklisted by Twitter to get fewer views. But then in October 4, 2020, I invited Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford and Dr. Sunita Gupta from Oxford, who is the preeminent infectious disease epidemiologist in the world. I invited them to come to the US, to Great Barrington in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And we also there a one-page document, which we call the Great Barrington Declaration, where we argue for, instead of doing lockdowns, we should do focused protections. We should do a better job protecting older people and let children and young adults live their lives, since they were at minuscule risk. And before that, they had sort of, we didn't follow the establishment narrative, so therefore we couldn't be heard. But the fact that there were three of us, so many people try to speak up, many other people try to speak up, but it was always dismissed that, oh, that person is not really an epidemiologist, or what does that person know about infectious diseases, or that person is not at a prominent university, or it's only one person who is then crazy. So the fact that there were three of us, the fact that we all have done work in infectious disease technology, and the fact that we were all at reasonably respectable universities meant that the Great Barrington Declaration could not be ignored. So many other people had said the same thing, both in scientists and the public. But the fact that there were the three of us burst out of the bubble, that the mainstream media could no longer ignore it. So they have to write about it. Yeah. And of course, they trashed these journalists and politicians. They trashed it, and the scientists, the head of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, called us fringe epidemiologists, asking for a devastating takedown. So there was, but it's fine to criticize what we said, but in my view, the important thing was to actually show people that there was no consensus for these lockdowns, because there were never consensus for these lockdowns among
Exactly.
the public health or scientific community.
Yeah.
So
But sincerely, but congratulations to the three of you as authors for bursting the bubble, the narrative, if you will, that there was somehow some consensus on all these lockdowns. There was not. There were many scientists, including yourself and others, who said there wasn't, but they were being stifled. You were being shut out of the public square unfairly. And to your credit, you had the courage to speak up and, as you say, burst that bubble so that you made a big impact.
Yeah, and I think what Francis Collins, the head of NIH, should have done, instead of calling for a devastating takedown, he should have organized like a meeting with people who were pro-lockdowns and then people who were pro-focus protection, and have
Indeed.
that open public discussion. So if he were a real scientist, that's what he should have done. But
Indeed.
no.
And so just to pick up on that, I think a very critical point is that you, knowing you, Martin, and those colleagues, among some others that are real scientists, you actually believe that the scientific process is being open-minded and seeking truth in a humble matter. Is that right? And that freedom of speech then really does matter. Is that correct?
Well, I believe that's the way it should be. I don't think that's the belief it currently is at the moment. We don't have an open scientific discourse in the United States, for sure, and neither do we have in many other countries. So I think there's a problem because we don't have that. And if we want to have a strong scientific society, then or community, then we have to have that open discourse. It can be fierce. It's okay if it's fierce. And we have had many fierce scientific debates in the past. That's fine. It should be polite and open. But fierce is okay as long as it's polite and open. No slandering, no bullying, no trying to silence other people.
Right on. So if you've just joined our discussion, to the audience, I'm talking with Dr. Martin Kulldorff, and we're talking about his story and his thoughts about many topics in terms of the follow-up of COVID-19 and his departure at Harvard University. So if we shift now to your story at Harvard, we all saw the incredible summation of your story in the City Journal. For those of you who haven't read it, I certainly do recommend that. But can you bring us up to speed then about being at Harvard University? I mean, you were a full professor there since 2003. Is that right?
I was on the faculty there since 2003, first a few years as an associate professor, and then I became a full professor. So for most of the time there, I was the full professor.
And you're certainly, as I referenced earlier, very productive and a leader in your field. So can you tell us what happened in summary, Martin?
Well, in addition to lockdowns, there was one other big controversy during, there were several other controversies, but one other one was about the vaccine mandates and about infection-acquired immunity, or sometimes called natural immunity. So we know since 430 BC, even earlier than the fall of Cleopatra, so in 430 BC, there was the Athenian plague. And when they describe it, they say that, well, if you already had it, you will not get it again, or not seriously again. So they used the people who had recovered to take care of those who got sick. So very smart. Very
so
smart.
You're talking about, to be clear, Martin, you're talking about the ancient Greeks knew about natural immunity.
Yeah, so this is 430 BC, almost 2,500 years ago, which, by the way, is about the same amount of time that we have known that the Earth is round rather than flat.
Yes.
So this is old knowledge about natural infection-acquired immunity. So, and for example, I'm a huge fan of the measles vaccine. It's a very important vaccine, but I've never taken it myself for the simple reason that I had measles before the vaccine was available for me to take. I'm that old. there's no need for me to take the measles vaccine because I have immunity from having had measles. So the vaccine is sort of meant to give you the immunity that you would get from having infection without actually having to become sick.
Mhm.
So sort of and if you just look at the smallpox vaccine, I think that has saved millions of lives. So vaccines has been a very important invention, very important part of medicine. But then the vaccine mandate, that doesn't make any sense because they mandated vaccines for everybody. So if you've already had COVID, you already had immunity that is superior to those who haven't had it but got the vaccine. That's exactly what you would expect. And we know from early on in the pandemic, already in summer 2020, that having had COVID gave you immunity. And and when you from only a few months after the vaccines came out, we knew that the natural immunity was superior to vaccine-induced immunity. Mm-hmm. Now, it's a little bit different from measles because if you've had measles, you will never get measles again ever. For coronavirus, it's a little bit different. So once you've had it, you can get it again, but it will not be as serious. So it'll be more of a mild disease. So you can get COVID a second time, or you can also get it after the vaccine. But you get it as a mild disease rather than a serious disease. And the purpose of the vaccine is to prevent deaths and hospitalizations. So let's do the thought experiment. Let's suppose this is a wonderful, perfect vaccine. It wasn't, because there were side effects, and it was as come to vaccines, it was not a perfect vaccine at all. But it did, I think, save all the people from dying. So in that sense, it served its purpose. But let's suppose it's a perfect vaccine, just for the sake of argument. Well, then you want to give it to people who need it. So you don't want to give it to people who already had COVID. So there's a shortage of vaccines. My 87-year-old neighbor hadn't gotten it. People in India and Brazil hadn't gotten it, while they were giving it to students at universities who had already had COVID because they were mandating it. So that's highly unethical to mandate a vaccine to people who don't need it, where there are older people around the world who haven't had COVID who could benefit from these vaccines. So when universities, and not just universities, but as an academic, I'm more upset about what the universities did. When the universities mandated students to get these vaccines, that was highly, highly unethical, because it meant that these students didn't need it, but others in the world needed it. So people died because of these vaccine mandates, because other people who needed the vaccine didn't get it. So it's highly unethical to do it from public health reasons. Now, there's also other arguments about bodily autonomy and those things, that we shouldn't force medical treatments on people. There are also arguments that if you force something on people, then they will resent it. And I think these vaccine mandates had caused a lot of hesitation and skepticism to vaccines in general. So people can complain all they want about so-called anti-vaxxers, but through several decades, they didn't really have much effect on vaccine uptake. But these vaccine fanatics who were mandating COVID vaccines and making false claims about these COVID vaccines that they will stop transmission, or like from the CDC, for example, or CDC claiming that once you've had it, got the vaccine, you can't get the disease, which is also false. So so these vaccine fanatics are the biggest anti-vaxxers, in my view, because they really have destroyed the confidence in vaccines in general.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. The paradox that, as you call them, the vaccine fanatics actually undermined the cause of public health, and specifically vaccines. So you came in and said, look, as a voice of reason, this whole idea of these blanket mandates for vaccination don't make sense. And you had your own particular reasoning as well for not taking it. you actually argued for natural immunity, something we've known for a long time.
Yeah, something we've known for almost 2,500 years, and then 3 years ago we forgot about it, and now we know about it again, I guess. So,
isn't that remarkable? So they instituted this mandate to get vaccinated in your workplace at Harvard. So were there exceptions made when it came to implementing that policy, or did they go after you specifically in some way?
So I had argued that instead of mandating the vaccine, they should actually hire like nurses and health staff who has natural immunity. But then when it came to the vaccine mandate where I work at the Mass General Brigham Hospital, which is the Harvard affiliated hospital, and where most Harvard faculty members work, and by the way, it's also the biggest recipient of NIH funding with over $1 billion a year. So they mandated vaccines, and I didn't need it. I had already had COVID. So I requested an exemption, both religious and medical exemptions. I also have an immune deficiency, a genetic immune deficiency. So in 2020, when I knew about the COVID came, I knew that I was going to be more sick than most people my age because I have this immune deficiency, which is genetic. And that was true also. I was in hospital, and the hospital saved my life. So I'm very grateful for that. But there was no reason for me then to take the vaccine at all, and it would have been unethical, as I mentioned. So I decided not to take the vaccine because I don't want to participate in unscientific endanger, and I don't want to participate in unethical policies. And I did apply for an exemption. Other people were granted exemption but I was not. So they decided to let me go.
Isn't that fascinating? So they decided to let you go for actually being, I would argue, a voice for public health.
Yeah, they fired me because I happen to believe in science that is 2,500 years old. That we know about 2,500 years, and this is Harvard. So
it's really a stunning story, and it is so disappointing, as we certainly over the years have looked up to a number of universities, including Harvard University, as a place of so-called reason, a place in search of the truth. I think that's one of its mottos, in search of truth. So, what I find remarkable as well is that in terms of looking back, hindsight is 2020. We can argue that. It is truly remarkable as we look back at the Great Barrington Declaration. You've had a lot of accolades. I mean, there were some million people that signed that declaration. But since that time, over the last few years, there's been a number of parties that were decision makers that have said, the Great Barrington Declaration made a lot of sense. I think the former head of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has actually commended the statement. How does that make you feel? Have you noticed that?
Yeah, so there are some, and I appreciate that, people who sort of clearly said that afterwards that the Great Barrington would have been the right way to do it. So I appreciate that. And the proof is in us. Sweden, who did not do the big lockdowns, they have the lowest excess mortality in the Western world. Mm-hmm. They have among the lowest COVID mortality, but then in excess mortality, you also take into account mortality for other reasons like heart disease or whatever that can be affected by lockdown. So when it comes to excess mortality, it's the lowest. And that's despite Sweden having sort of high mortality in the beginning to begin with, because it's a highly developed country. So despite that, makes it even harder to do well when it comes to excess mortality. So yeah, Sweden did very well, by not following the rest of the established narrative of the rest of the world. So it's sort of you can't really argue for these lockdowns anymore, and most people who argue for them have gone silent because they kind of at least intuitively know that maybe they did the wrong thing. So they want, of course, to focus on other things now. Nobody wants to people who were pushing for school closures like Anthony Fauci and Randy Weingarten in the US, they are now lying and claiming that they were trying to open schools. So nobody is arguing that school closures were correct anymore. So that's good. And I think that will be little by little, it will become to a general consensus that these lockdowns and these vaccine mandates were a huge failure.
It is truly amazing story. So I'm talking with Dr. Martin Kulldorff. We welcome your questions on the chat. What do you think? Were the lockdowns justified? What do you think? Were wise decisions made? What do we learn from this kind of story, including the story of Dr. Martin Kulldorff? So it is really remarkable that Sweden at the time of these lockdowns was considered a, quote, outlier, when in fact, ironically, they were doing what mainstream public health would have mandated or advised. No lockdowns. Don't shut the kids out of school. Protect the vulnerable. And certainly don't mandate through a third party, namely the coercion of the government, these vaccines. Like, don't compel people to this. And Sweden came out of this really well. When you mentioned about all the total mortality rates, I think the numbers are approximately, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but they were half of the United States and half of Canada.
For COVID mortality, I think that's approximately, I don't remember the exact number, that's approximately true for COVID mortality, yeah.
All right, so the other thing that I find very interesting about your story, if you step back a little bit, is you were really arguing, Martin, for good public policy analysis, looking at the statistics, looking at the mathematics of these issues, looking at options and weighing them in total, not just simply saying, it's one variable that we're going to look at, but we need to look at the whole picture of society. Is that correct?
Yeah. Public health is not about a single disease. It's about all aspects of public health. And then, of course, education and other things are also important. Social life, the economy, etc. So for some reason, society decided to focus exclusively on COVID. And that's a disaster to do that. Doesn't matter whether it's diseases or something else. You can't exclusively focus on only one thing. You have to see the broader picture. And then you have to follow in public health. I mean, we have these long-standing principles that we have. They are there to improve the public health of people. We have to not just think about public health today. We have to think of the long-term consequences. So yeah, if we skip cancer screening in 2020, that's not going to increase mortality in 2020. It will increase the mortality in 2025 or 2030. So we have to look at it not just short term, but also long term.
Exactly. So I do have a question from the audience, and that is basically, why do you think in retrospect they let you go at Harvard University? And I think the inference there is the question is really simple, but I guess it infers that in retrospect, any rational party would have known that this is a complex issue. So why would they have just simply weighed in and fired people like yourself?
So obviously, I can't read people's minds, so one has to ask people at Harvard that. But I think that if we had been proven wrong in the Great Barrington Declaration, then they would have taken pity on us, and we could have continued our scientific careers and go back to what we did before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But the fact that we were right that's inexcusable, because we embarrass them. So they're never they will never forgive us for being right and for embarrassing them for being wrong. And some people are trying to argue now, well, it was impossible to know, or nobody could have known. But the proof is there that with the Great Barrington Declaration, 1 million people knew. So that's not an excuse. So I think that those in scientific leadership position, like university presidents or the deans or the university hospital presidents or the heads of the big journals, the editors of the big journals or the funding agencies, they would never forgive us.
Okay, so that's a very interesting take on this issue. I see two levels of irony, Martin, to this whole mess. One is that a place such as Harvard, a hospital where you were on site, we look to them with a sense of trust and confidence that they are centers of scientific inquiry and insight, and we count on them to be seeking the truth, not following some kind of political narrative. So then the second irony to this, I think, is that we saw through the release of, say, the Twitter files, we've seen all kinds of emails in retrospect that prove that they knew that much of this was hooey, don't we? We know that they knew about the farces of social distancing. We've had admissions from a number of parties. In fact, a friend of ours has done an incredible documentary called COVID Collateral. I certainly advise anyone to watch that. It's really well done by Vanessa Dillon about the story of COVID. And the former head of the CDC comes forward in a discussion where they were releasing that film and said the Great Barrington Declaration was right. But they were muzzled. So they knew they knew that you were right, that you were following the best practices. Now, I mean, there's always the details of each specific thing, but consistently behind the scenes, they knew that a lot of their actions being taken were incorrect, but they went along with it anyways. Isn't that a stunning irony to this whole story?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of the people who after the lockdowns knew that they were wrong versus thought that they were the right thing, and or maybe they were just afraid for themselves and they were in panic mode. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm not a psychologist, but it would be interesting to have a psychologist do a study on the psychology of how people were thinking and acting and arguing during this pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. I do have another question. What would have happened if the government listened to the recommendations from the Great Barrington Declaration?
Fewer people would have died.
Fewer people would have died.
Yeah. The children would not have suffered through not going to school. School is important for children. The pandemic would not have lasted as long. And that's because what lockdowns did is it did sort of push things forward in time. Mm-hmm. So it would have ended sooner if we had followed the Great Barrington Declaration. It probably would have ended in the northern hemisphere. Probably would have ended in by the end of the spring of 2021. Mm-hmm.
So it's a profound question. So there would have been incredibly positive benefits on the health side, let alone economic benefits, given the horrendous costs that we incurred as a society, let alone untold stress, in really every level. I think that, it goes back to your earlier summation, Martin, of the impacts of this, of the management of COVID-19. It would have been pretty much the opposite as we experienced in Sweden. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think excess mortality around the world will probably be very similar to Sweden.
Yeah. So great questions from the audience. Has anyone ever apologized to you, Martin, in light of what we know now, in retrospect?
There was one guy, he's a faculty in Texas. He did apologize, but I think that might be the only one. And then he became a very active advocate against lockdowns.
Okay.
So he realized that he has been bamboozled. And then he went with but no, most people are silent. And in a sense, the fact that people go silent is just a form of apology, I think.
All right. Well, you certainly are very gracious, Martin, in terms of your interactions. I know that to be true over a number of years of discussions with you. But it is certainly a sincere question. Has anyone apologized? And it begs for me the question to what extent people make decisions out of, frankly, a sense of ego and hubris rather than out of kind of a rational, good natured. Like I experience you, this is my personal observation, as someone who's sincerely caring about the cause of science and health for people, like the way you refer to care for children. That's what we would hope for the best of people as scientists. And so this kind of nonsensical decision making really begs serious questions in my mind about who are these people in these roles who, instead of leading and going through the scientific process and the search for truth, are more vested in their ego. Am I being too harsh?
Well, I think that maybe if you go back 100 years, probably the scientific organizations and universities and journals were led by really the top scientists. But I think we have come to a situation now where a lot of them are ruled by career scientists who they know how to do to climb the career ladder in science, but and that's more important maybe to them than the actual science.
Okay, so not to be unfair to bureaucrats, because we need good bureaucrats, but we have a lot of careerists who are really not scientists anymore. They're people who are caught up with climbing the career ladder. And
yeah, and I'm happy that other people wants to be a dean or a president of university, because I don't. I want to do science. So I'm happy that other people do it.
Indeed.
But you can't. But if you're to be a good administrator, you have to ensure that there's an open scientific debate.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so we have another question.
In terms of apology, I mean, it's not really me have to be people have to apologize to. I think what people should apologize to is all the children who are suffered, all the old people who died alone without their family, and so on. So it's really, and to the truckers in Canada who was really badly treated. So those are the people I think that should be apologized to.
Indeed. And I will certainly never forget. I remember the other year we had quite a discussion with you and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya about the Canadian truckers and how they, in your perspective, I certainly don't want to put words in your mouth, captured the world's imagination as they drove down the highways of Canada on the way to the nation's capital in Ottawa. That, in fact, the mandates did not make sense and that they followed the science, and so many experts, quote experts, did not.
Correct.
I do have a question from the audience again. What are you doing, Dr. Kulldorff, to ensure that we handle the next pandemic properly?
That is an important question, because we have to make sure that we don't do the same mistakes again. And I think the one thing we need to do is we have to get the history right. So we'll write the history about this pandemic. And the important thing is that we write that history correctly. Because if we don't, we will repeat the same mistakes again. So the next generation of public health scientists, when they go to school, they go and they learn about this pandemic, it has to be clear that this is an example of how not to do things.
Okay, so that is a very profound question, and a very profound answer is documenting the lessons learned from this incredible case study, so the next generation of leaders in public health do not forget.
Yeah.
Know what happened, right?
And there will be another pandemic, whether it's 5 years from now or 20 or 50 or 100 years from now, we don't know, but there will be another pandemic because there has been pandemics throughout history. We don't know the nature of it, but whoever is in charge then, it has to be clear to them that what we did for COVID was a huge mistake.
Indeed, it's a huge mistake. Yeah. So, but in this context, surely one of the lessons of history is that leaders, including yourself, Martin, had the incredible courage to speak up and risk everything. And one of the comments from the audience is, "We are forever grateful to those who risked everything to speak the truth." Dr. Kulldorff, thank you, sir. What a lovely comment.
Thank you for those very kind words. I appreciate them.
So one of the lessons learned in retrospect was, of course, the so-called Twitter files, the acquisition by the great Elon Musk. And the revelations there, we saw literally tens of thousands of emails that proved that the some 87 agencies, as I recall, from the U.S. government alone, among others, through the 5 agreements that included Canada, to actively censor all kinds of topics and discussions and policy matters, from COVID-19, from climate issues to all kinds of them. It's really quite a train wreck. And we learned that the censorship was active, it was directive, and it was a quid pro quo. If you're going to have the license as a social media company to exist, you're going to follow our party line. When you look back at that in retrospect, and I've shown clips as well where there's U.S. congressional hearings that cite the censorship of yourself and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. I mean, you were even a party as well as Jay in this Missouri-Louisiana Biden case that went to the Supreme Court. And maybe we can talk about that in a minute, but that censorship still continues on, doesn't it, Martin?
Yeah, if you told me 5 years ago that I would be censored as a scientist because I said basic scientific facts, I would have thought you maybe need to go to the lunacy house. I would not have believed you, but that's exactly what happened. When I said that if you've had COVID, you don't need the COVID vaccine, that was censored by Twitter and many other instances as well. Mm-hmm. And it was censored on the behalf of the US government. So sometimes the government interacted directly with Twitter and Facebook and other social media companies. And sometimes they did it indirectly. They funded at Stanford this thing called the Variety Project. Yes. So they gave them money to monitor social media feeds and then tell Twitter and others when they should censor because they went against what the government said. So if the CDC said something that was wrong and I said something that was right, I was censored. So you can't do science that way. But you can't have a society that way. A society that censors its citizens is a society in decline. And it's very scary. I mean, the whole scientific revolution, the scientific enlightenment that we've had since the 16th century is based on open exchange of scientific ideas. Exactly. Some are right, some turn out to be right, some turn out to be wrong, but we have to have that open exchange.
No healthy debate, no freedom of speech, no science, no innovation, no prosperous society. So these issues matter big time, don't they?
And I mean, I think that the First Amendment in the US, the freedom of speech, is valid even if you say that the earth is flat. You should have a right to say that if you want to. In this case, they censored things that were true, but they shouldn't even censor things that are false. And actually, if there are scientists who have a different view of me, I don't want them to be censored. I want them to be able to state what they think so that I can come up with sort of counter arguments and say, no, that's not right. this and that. So I don't want my opponents to be censored. I want them to actually speak so that then people can listen to both sides. And actually, that's what happened in Sweden in 2020. I was there in favor of the establishment government view of not doing the lockdowns, but there were some people in academia, not too many infectious disease technologists, but others who wanted to do more lockdowns. And it was a very open and frank debate, which I participated in. And I think it was very good that they actually did write those things. What they wrote, arguing for lockdowns, was wrong, but I'm glad that they did it. They actually did a service to Sweden by doing it, because that meant that the public could actually read what was the argument for lockdowns, and those of us who opposed it, what were our arguments, and then they could balance them. And I think we came out on top because we had the better scientific arguments for it. But I'm very glad, I'm very thankful that they actually did publish their thoughts. If they had all been silent, there wouldn't have been that debate. And I think that was a very good debate to have for the public.
Well said. We need each other. We need healthy debate. It's interesting, in the Canadian context, in the July 29 issue of the Epoch Times, there was a headline that Ottawa is funding a, quote, misinformation detection tool. It will be relying on artificial intelligence. The Minister of Heritage, I believe her name is Pascale Saint-Onge, says polls confirm that most Canadians are very concerned about the rise of misinformation. We are fighting for Canadians to get the facts right. Well, my question to you is, are they fighting for facts or just their facts? And are they really serving Canadians, or let alone the cause of science?
Well, I live in the US, and I'm very concerned about the rise in misinformation from the US government, like CDC, for example, which was widespread during the pandemic. So, yes, we should try to minimize misinformation. But it's ironic when a government when the Canadian government was responsible for a lot of misinformation, it's sort of ironic when they are complaining about it. If they want to deal with it, they should just keep quiet.
Right. They're the origin and spreaders of misinformation. And how dare they define in their narrow terms about what are the facts and misinformation? That's why we need debate, isn't it?
Exactly. So if you argue that the Earth is flat, please do so. And I will leave it to astronomers to argue against you that it is round.
Yes.
That is the right debate to have.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we've had that debate. And therefore, we have come to the consensus that the Earth is not flat, it's round. And we should have the same debates about other scientific topics. And in some cases, like infection-acquired immunity, it's very clear that it exists. There are other scientific issues where we don't know the truth yet.
Indeed.
And that's okay too. Then we just say honestly, well, we don't know if this is true or not. We're trying to find out. So that's part of scientific debate, to acknowledge ignorance.
Indeed. And so we're getting into kind of a zone here where it seems like there's a number of parties in our society that, and this has happened through history, where the king, the queen want to control information. They want to push their so-called narrative. They don't want healthy debate. And so one of the fascinating things is the jurisdiction of the province of British Columbia, where you had, during COVID-19, the departure of some 10,000 healthcare professionals. And this was, not uncommon around the world, where you had a lot of health professionals who said, I'm out of here. This is crazy. How this whole thing is being managed. And then you had, ultimately, as they kept clamping down the mandates for vaccines, they ultimately ended up firing 3,000 healthcare professionals in the province of British Columbia. Does this sound familiar, Martin Kulldorff?
It does sound
So this
familiar.
it sounds so familiar. So this is an example of many jurisdictions, and it's amazing because the last many months, different opposition leaders of parties have been calling for the reinstatement of these different healthcare workers, including the 3,000 that were fired, including by they've been calling for this for some time. So just this last week, the premier of the province and the medical officer of health have announced the rehiring of these healthcare workers. And yet there's no tabling of information, no policy analysis that shows why this decision, this change has been made. How do you react to that, Dr. Kulldorff? What's going on here?
I'm very happy that they have come to the senses and that they are offering to rehire these healthcare workers. And I read that they also are saying that they will retain their seniority level. So that's also good. I think they should also get the back pay. They were obviously mistreated.
Indeed.
But this is certainly a step in the right direction. So I think if there's a slow recognition in society that what was done was wrong, and the people in charge are now slowly, as quietly as they can, trying to patch things up. So it's good that it's going in that direction. And it's thanks to all the pressure that's put by the public, who are seeing through this nonsense, these ridiculous things. So we should thank the whole public, all the people who speak up, people who, the truckers, the healthcare workers who did not go along with the nonsense and so on. And I mean, in Canada, there were some very brave people who spoke up from the very beginning, like two physicians, one Matthew Strauss and also Kulvinder Kaur, who both took a lot of heat and suffered a lot for speaking up with honesty and integrity. So those are, in my view, Canadian heroes. Wayne Gretzky is also a Canadian hero of mine, as I like hockey. But I'll add these two to the.
Okay. That's great. Yeah, the Swedes and the Canadians, we get along, and those are very important points to acknowledge, is the incredible courage by so many parties to speak up like that. So thank you for reminding us of that. So I'm talking with Dr. Martin Kulldorff, and I've really appreciated the audience's questions. So please keep them coming as we get in the home stretch here. And one of the things that really strikes me about this is that you were a voice, among others, of reason for calling for an intelligent evaluation of the options, the responses to COVID-19. And one of the parts to that just fascinates me is that we know that in decision-making, we obviously in life need to make initial decisions. But midway through, we know that if we look at evaluation, the fine art of evaluation in statistics and mathematics, we look for midpoints to say maybe our initial decision was wrong, and maybe given the feedback loop of data and evidence in transparent fashion, maybe we're wrong and we should stop what we're doing and back away from it. Are you fascinated? Like what has gone on here that we would continue on in some measure in different jurisdictions? The mandates are still being pursued, even though you have vaccine manufacturers like AstraZeneca pulling their products out of the market. So what's going on here, Martin, from your perspective? Why are we continuing on with various mandates when in fact we know that masks really don't work? We know that, like I could just go on and on, like the whole social distancing thing. Like we had, who was it? One of the advocates, was it Tony Fauci himself, who said this whole drawing of circles and social distancing really was kind of made up. So why aren't we backing away from this stuff when we clearly know it's wrong?
I do think that we are gradually backing away from it. It's a very slow process and it's frustratingly slow, but we are gradually backing away from it. I think there are people in leadership roles who just cannot accept that they were wrong. They won't acknowledge that. And therefore they're sticking to their guns to the detriment of society. But there has been enough pressure. And I mean, just the trucker protest in Canada, I think, had an enormous influence on what Canada did subsequently. I think the prime minister and the politicians tried to pretend it didn't, but it obviously had enormous influence on Canada subsequently. So I think we're moving in the right direction. The thing that when it comes to the COVID measures, what is worrying me more right now is actually the freedom of speech, because I see that that's not the infringement on freedom of speech is not going away; it's increasing. So the rulers, the ruling class, they're doubling down on censorship, and I think it's because they are scared. They see themselves as vulnerable. A king who sits secure in power don't need to do censorship, but the rulers that feel threatened, that's when they engage in censorship. And I think they feel threatened right now, and that's why they are pushing censorship so hard.
All right. So those are very wise insights. So what can we do then? Do you have advice or insights what we as citizens can do? And I want to give you an example, and it pertains to your own situation, and that is I'm aware of a petition on change.org that is a petition calling for your reinstatement at Harvard University. Golly, it sounds like that's a good thing to sign, isn't it, Martin? And who knows whether Harvard will ever find its bearing again, as they said goodbye to their previous president for many reasons, including she has a track record of a huge amount of plagiarism, but she's still employed there. I mean, you can't make this stuff up at $900,000 a year. Should we sign that petition to reinstate you, Martin? What are other things we can do to help turn this situation around?
I think the key thing is to always speak up. And if people censor you, don't be quiet. Continue to speak up anyhow. So make it as hard as possible for people to engage in censorship. I think that is critically important, and both publicly and privately. I think it's important. So I think the defense of the First Amendment and if you're a scientist, the defense of academic freedom and scientific discourse, I think is the most important thing we can do right now. Everything else sort of depends on that. If we don't have freedom of speech, we cannot defend all the other rights that we have.
You're absolutely right. So well said, Dr. Martin Kulldorff. Often it's been said that the best leadership is leadership by example, and you've been an inspiring example of courage and integrity. And I can say that you generally care about the people that public health professionals should care about, and that is the people. So bravo on you, Martin. And we certainly wish you and your family all the very best. And thank you so much for spending this incredible time and discussion with us today.
Thank you, David. And also thank you to the listeners who sent in the question. That was very nice.
It's very good. So thank you again for joining us today for this discussion with Dr. Martin Kulldorff. And please check out our website at Frontier. We'd love to hear more from you about your comments about this important topic. And until next week, I bid you adieu and thank you for joining us.